I'm presenting on some work that I've done with Merran McAlister. These are preliminary findings and would appreciate questions afterwards to explore the findings further. I'll begin by showing where our study fits in the context of earlier research on perpetrators of IBSA, and then I'll describe our findings on IBSA offending generally after that. Merran will zoom in more closely on different offender types of IBSA, the 3 different types, and then we'll talk about some of the implications for our research. Together, we'll cover who are proceeded against by police for IBSA offences, who are the victim survivors of alleged IBSA offenders, and what are the patterns of offending of alleged IBSA perpetrators. As Nicola and her colleague Gemma Beard noted in a paper last year, IBSA is an umbrella term, and we have heard about these terms in the previous presentation. Sextortion, it includes behaviours like sextortion, non-consensual sexting, deepfake pornography, as well as the more controversial terms and problematic terms like revenge pornography, upskirting and downblousing. And these behaviours can be categorised in 3 ways, as Savannah made clear in her presentation. The capturing, taking or creating of an intimate image without the consent of the person in the image. Next is distributing or sharing an intimate image without consent. And finally, threatening to take or share an intimate image. IBSA is widespread in Australia and elsewhere, but research has also made clear that there is a problem of underreporting of IBSA. A national survey by eSafety found that only around a quarter of respondents who had experienced IBSA had taken some form of action in response to their most recent experience. Some victims contact eSafety, as we've heard earlier today. Victims also have other options as well. That eSafety Commissioner survey I mentioned found that 7 in 10 respondents who knew where to go for information or support said they would go to police about the distribution of intimate images. Now, research on IBSA and the police has covered important topics such as victim survivor reporting experiences, as well as police knowledge and attitudes of IBSA, and so on. But there have been fewer studies that have examined police-recorded data on IBSA. Although these data are limited to crimes that are detected by or reported to the police, they can provide us information about IBSA offenders that's important to detection and the prevention of IBSA offending, and it can also tell us about the policing of IBSA itself. One of the difficulties, though, of analysing police-recorded IBSA data is that our National Offence Classification Standard hasn't included a separate category for IBSA offences. But the AIC's Australian Sexual Offence Statistical Collection addresses this limitation by measuring IBSA offences. The AIC set up the Australian Sexual Offence Statistical Collection in 2022 to monitor and measure the extent and nature of sexual offending in Australia. Importantly, it also brings together data on sexual offenders, offences, and their victims. And it covers a range of sexual offences against both children and adults. Today we'll focus on the image-based sexual abuse offences. We defined IBSA based on a comprehensive legislative review that our colleagues at the AIC completed, and that definition is the taking and/or distribution of an intimate image without the consent of the person depicted, or the threatened taking and distribution of such an image. By intimate, we're talking about a sexual or nude image, And when we talk about image, we're talking about a still photo as well as video or an altered image. We analysed data on 772 alleged offenders who had been proceeded against by police for one or more IBSA offences. We used 22-23 financial year police recorded data, and the data came from 4 of the 6 jurisdictions that were participating in the Australian Sexual Offence Statistical Collection. They were New South Wales, Victoria, the ACT and the Northern Territory. There are differences in recording practices among police in different jurisdictions, and there are also legislative differences for this and other offences. But we've used the coding that was directed by that legislative review that I mentioned to code these IBSA offences as well as the different types of IBSA. And we're attempting to examine the characteristics of offenders and their victims and the patterns of offending rather than estimating the prevalence of this type of offending. So the data include almost 1,900 offences, which amounts to just over 800 incidents. In total, police proceeded against 772 offenders for one or more IBSA offences, and these were an index offence. So the offender had come to the attention of the police for their first or only offence, which was an IBSA offence. They may have had other offences as well, and it may not have been their most serious, but they did have an IBSA offence. Most IBSA offenders were male, but 15% were female. Adult offenders of IBSA were most commonly in their late 20s or early 30s, and 7% of IBSA offenders were Indigenous. We found that male and female offenders had a similar age distribution, but as you can see here, these are the numbers. There were many more male offenders than female offenders. Children and adolescents aged 10 to 15 were included in this group. They made up 11%. We recognise there are differences between the characteristics and the consequences of IBSA that involves adults and IBSA that involves children, as well as child sexual abuse material offences. But we have included IBSA by and against children in this study to give a full account of the IBSA offences that police are proceeding against, and we'll draw out differences between those two groups where they are relevant. For example, you can see here the male-female distribution was much more even for for children and adolescents than it was for adults, with 47 boys and 38 girls. And if we look at those as a proportion of all males, you can see that the males aged 10 to 15 made up 8% of all males, but they made up 27% of all females. So we had a small number of female offenders, and almost a third of them were children or adolescents. For adult and young offenders, most knew their victim in some way. For adult offenders, the most common relationship was a former or a current intimate partner. And for children and adolescents, they were most commonly a non-family member who was known to the victim, such as an acquaintance. And you can see the problem that was mentioned in the keynote this morning, the high number of not stated and unknown relationship for both adult and young offenders. I said that we are focused on perpetrators in this presentation, but we do have some information on the victims of those perpetrators. 770 victims of at least one IBSA offence were included in our analysis. These are the victims of the alleged perpetrators. Most of these victims, most of the adult victims, I beg your pardon, were female. And again, like the adult offenders, they were in their late 20s or early 30s, most commonly, and 3% were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Again, the age distribution for female and male offenders were similar, but a higher number of victims, but a higher number of female victims. Young victims, so these are people aged 15 years and under. They made up 17% of all victims, and we can see there are about 3 times as many girl as boy victims. I should stress these are quite different findings to the earlier presentation, but it's a different group. It's people who have gone to the police. Now, I have talked about offender and victim characteristics separately up until this point, but our data also enables us to examine offender and victim pairings or dyads. And based on what we've learned already in this presentation, it's not surprising that IBSA mostly involved males offending against females. Other pairings such as males offending against males and females offending against females were less common. We also found that adult offenders perpetrated offences against victims across a range of different age groups, but 4 in 10 adult offender-victim pairs comprised offenders and victims who were in the same age group. That was quite common. And there's the breakdown for male and female offenders. And that was even a stronger finding for children and adolescents, where 84% of child-adolescent pairs comprised offenders aged 10 to 15 and victims 15 years and under. We were also interested in the extent to which IBSA perpetrators had other offences. And we found that 76% of IBSA offenders were proceeded against for at least one other non-IBSA offence in 22-23. And the most common other offence was acts intended to cause injury, which includes offences such as assault and stalking. So I've described our findings on IBSA offenders and victims generally. Next, Merran will discuss the details on specific types of IBSA, which we'll see are different in some respects, and also discuss the implications for policy and law enforcement practices.
Thank you, Tom. Hopefully I can figure out how this clicker works. Our results showed that there were 228 IBSA offenders with at least one or more capturing offences, 391 IBSA offenders with at least one or more distributing offences, and 249 offenders with one or more threatening offences. As you can see on the screen, offenders with distributing offences were the most common. This finding does differ to previous survey data of victims, which found that capturing offences were most common. However, it does align with the previous analysis of police and courts data in Victoria. Most of these IBSA offenders were proceeded against for only one type of IBSA offence, so this means that, broadly speaking, IBSA offenders tended not to stray too far from their IBSA offending type, despite being proceeded against for a range of other offences, which I will go into more a little later on. Where there was some overlap, as you can see on the screen, this was mainly by adult offenders. The most common type of IBSA offender was a distributing one for all age groups, except for those aged 45 and over, where capturing offenders were slightly more common. And as I gave you a bit of a preview before, among children and adolescent offenders, as you can see on the screen, distributing offenders were far more common than capturing or threatening offenders. Adult capturing, distributing and threatening offenders all tend to be around the same age, in their late 20s to early 30s. And for each type of IBSA offence, most offenders were male, but a higher proportion of the distributing offenders were female compared with capturing or threatening offenders. And again, as you can see on the screen just at the bottom, the male and female adult offenders also tended to be around the same age, again in their late 20s to early 30s. There were 218 victims of capturing offenders, 284 of distributing offenders, and 226 of threatening offenders. Capturing victims tended to be younger than victims of distributing and threatening offenders. And the majority of victims, as we've heard, were female. However, the proportions did differ between the three IBSA types. The largest proportion, as you can see on the screen, were victims of threatening offenders, accounting for 89%, with most threatening offenders victimising a current or former intimate partner. In general, most IBSA offenders, or adult offenders I should say, were known to their victim in some way. Distributing offenders also commonly targeted a current or former intimate partner, and a smaller proportion of capturing offenders also targeted a current or former intimate partner, but they were equally as likely to also target non-family members they knew or a stranger. Where we mentioned earlier about most children and adolescents being proceeded against for an IBSA offence and these being distributing offences, almost 2/3 of these were a non-family member that they knew. We also heard earlier that most IBSA adult offenders were proceeded against for other offences in 22-23, and we found that 90% of threatening offenders were proceeded against for other offences in the reference period. The types of offences that these offenders were proceeded against for did differ across the IBSA types. Most threatening offenders were proceeded against for violent offences, and distributing offenders were also commonly proceeded against for offences related to acts intended to cause injury. Capturing offenders, or a smaller proportion of capturing offenders, were also proceeded against for this offence. However, they were basically equally as likely to be proceeded against for other sexual offences. And each IBSA type also had a range of other offences as well. I've put the top 3 on the screen, but as you can see, these included other offences such as offences against justice procedures, which include breaches. So in general, we found that most IBSA offending involved male offenders and female victims. This may reflect the more severe harms that female victim survivors experience and the increased likelihood that they will go to the police and go through the potentially burdensome criminal justice process. Male victim survivors may also choose not to report due to stigma. Smaller but equal proportions of offending involved different combinations of offender and victim pairings. And we also found a higher proportion of female children and adolescents were proceeded against for IBSA offences. Larger proportions of adult offenders victimised a current or former intimate partner, whereas children and adolescents most commonly victimised a non-family member they knew. When we looked at the different types of IBSA offending, we found that there were higher proportions of distributing offenders for all age groups except for those aged 45 and over, again where capturing offences were slightly more common. And this predominance of distributing offences might reflect the tendency for more serious offending to be reported to police. Male offenders were dominant for all IBSA types, but a higher proportion of female offenders were proceeded against for distributing offences. And alleged threatening and distributing offenders commonly targeted a current or former intimate partner, whereas the victims of capturing offenders tended to be more evenly spread across the relationship types. There are several implications for this study. An updated version of ANZOC was recently released that disaggregates types of sexual offending, including IBSA, and this is a positive step towards better understanding the different types of sexual offending. Especially crimes that are being committed in an online environment. It also means that the ABS Recorded Crime Victim and Offender series will be able to measure crime using this category. And the ASOS collection will continue to measure IBSA, with the ANZOC update improving the collection of this type of crime across the jurisdictions. The low levels of IBSA, or police recorded IBSA, highlights the importance of continuing to raise awareness about this type of offending, again, relative to prevalence estimates that we are currently aware of. Our results suggest that particular attention might be required to educate Australians about capturing and threatening offenders, or offences in particular, as they were less commonly reported or recorded by police than distributing ones. As we've heard earlier, our results indicate the importance of targeted educational campaigns, especially at children and young people, as we also heard in the keynote this morning, about how campaigns can help to inform victim survivors about the ways they can respond, and potential perpetrators about the risks of offending, as well as bystanders about how they can appropriately support victim survivors and intervene where possible. The last implication relates to the role of law enforcement and their participation in awareness about IBSA laws and the consequences of offending, again, particularly for children and young people. Efforts to reduce barriers to reporting may also help to assist in helping the problem of underreporting, which we know is quite prevalent. For example, research has identified the key role that specialist family violence officers at Victoria Police have had in overcoming some of the barriers to reporting IBSA offending. And lastly, the training and education of police about IBSA offending and the co-occurrence with other offences would be useful given the role it plays in certain behaviours such as coercive control. So overall, this collection allows us to build a knowledge base on the characteristics of offenders, their offending patterns and who their victims are. It also provides us with a more nuanced understanding about the different types of sexual offending, and in this case, IBSA. And this may enable more targeted prevention, disruption and detection of this form of sexual offending. Thank you.